my mom was always, really proud about like community service, being involved in government, staying engaged, just being a good citizen. That's actually like one of the things that she said before she passed. And we did kind of an interview for, her grandchildren. And she was all about just like be the best American you can be a good citizen. And that includes things like, scouting. So she was like our Girl Scout troop leader. I became our Girl Scout troop leader for my daughters. You give back to your family, you give back to the community. And it just made sense that you help people when they're in need.
Welcome back to Unsung Americans. I'm your host, Alex Natsios. Thanks a lot for joining me again here. Today we have Melissa Cook, who is going to bring some unique perspective as someone who both grew up overseas, but also spent her career doing foreign aid work and spent a lot of time working overseas as well. We've known each other for a long time. You have some stories about me we're not going to talk about on the air.
That's for the paid podcast.
I'm glad to have you, and I'm glad that you're not going to talk about those stories. But one of them includes you getting me out of a lot of trouble, actually. But we're going to leave that alone, as it's irrelevant to this discussion today. But
the
anyhow,
good thing for you is that I can't remember a lot of that story either. But
right.
Glad we're both here, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. No one needs to know. But thanks for joining us today. Maybe we can just start off, kind of as I mentioned. You grew up partially overseas, at least, isn't that right?
Yeah. When I was about 10 years old, my dad joined the Foreign Service. And so, we lived in really exotic places like Canada and Saudi Arabia and France. But yeah, I got into international development, kind of a different pathway, but kind of started that way. Especially Saudi Arabia really opened up my eyes to the differences in the world, coming from suburban Virginia, and then suddenly landing in the Middle East in the early 1990s. And I just loved it. I love culture. I love language. I love meeting different people. I love the different foods, the tradition, all of it. So.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Not from having grown up overseas myself, but spending all that time overseas.
Yeah.
And I think I know this, but to clarify, it was the State Department Foreign Service. He was a diplomat, right? Not U.S. aid.
Correct. Yeah, he was with the State Department in the consular affairs, I think.
Okay. So what did that mean? We've actually never talked about this, I don't think, but oddly. But in Saudi Arabia then? Did it mean you lived on a compound, and what did life look like there? How old were you in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, let's see, I think I was 12 years old when we first moved there.
So as a 12-year-old, what was life like? Yeah.
Crazy. It was, of course, like I was in the full throes of adolescence. And I lived there with my dad and one of my brothers, because I had another brother that stayed back in the US and he was in college. And my mom, it took a while to sell the house at home, so she never ended up coming to Saudi. So it was really kind of an interesting time to like live just with your dad and your brother in such a male-dominated society that was so different than, where I'd come from just outside of Washington, D.C. And this was, pre-internet age. We lived in Jeddah, so not Riyadh. We did not live on a compound. A lot of people thought we did live on a compound. We lived in the city, amongst most people. And I remember when we first moved there, it was Ramadan. And I remember, just the excitement of like everything opening up at nighttime and enjoying food together with other Saudis and families. And it was great. I remember like eating like kebabs on the street and then walking home to our place. I remember my dad liked to feed all of the desert cats from our balcony. And so we would end up with like 30 cats. And I just thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I was there when McDonald's first opened. So like Saudi's changed a lot in like the 30 plus years that I've lived there. It's really opening up. It's very different. I haven't been there myself, but I was there, before, like when you had to get bootlegged movies on VHS with like a a picture that somebody had taken of the movie picture, and then it was filmed on like a really shitty camera from the movie theater. And now to think of it like today, where it's like really opening up and modernizing, kind of like Dubai, I'd love to go back.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's interesting. I mean, to see that for an extended period of time too, not like a 2 week visit or, a kind of in and out, but no, that's cool. And you're saying that had a big effect on you wanting to do foreign aid work.
It, well, it didn't exactly, if I'm being honest. I mean,
Sure.
like a lot of Americans, I didn't know what USAID and foreign aid was until I was an adult. I was just a kid, and so I knew I wanted to do something international because I love traveling. I love, learning about different cultures and languages, like I said. But I just knew kind of like the careers that I saw. So I figured I would be a diplomat like my dad, and I was studying the Foreign Service exam. It's one of the reasons that I met and married my husband. He was at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And I was like, this is great. We're going to lead this international lifestyle. But he ended up working with animals, which is
Becoming
also
a vet,
so
yeah, that's right.
cool. But yeah, anyhow, I there was an opening when I studied international business when I was in college, and I worked at an economic think tank in London for a little bit, and there was an opening at a consulting firm in Washington D.C. for a big consulting firm that managed USAID projects across a variety of different areas. And my mom, she developed a career as an insurance agent, and she actually, later, after she was done raising me and my brothers, she designed specialized programs for American companies and Canadian companies that operate overseas, including, agencies like the State Department and USAID. So she
Nice.
did all that kind of specialized coverage of like, how do you insure, I don't know, cars in Ukraine, for example, safely. And so she was like, this is a good company. I know it, and they do good work. So I applied, I got the job. And I was very humbled after I first started because I realized that I had been interviewing with people that had dedicated their lives and their careers to development. They had been Peace Corps volunteers and, studied it in graduate school and had master's degrees. And I was this kind of like lucky young person that got a job. I don't know how I got the job, but I did, and I'm so grateful. I ended up working on lots of really interesting projects. I think one of the first ones that really made an impact was FuseNet in Afghanistan, which is, this well, for
Famine early warning systems, right?
exactly. And it just made sense to me. It was so practical. It's a global program, and they have scientists around the world and practitioners that are just monitoring the environmental conditions in a country so that you can predict if there's going to be a drought, there will be famine, and that kind of information gathering then you give to policymakers so that they can mobilize aid resources, and you can prevent famine, you can prevent drought, you can save people's lives in a really important way. And so programs like that, it was like, oh, just slowly getting more introduction to what we do. It really connected back with my upbringing, my personal upbringing, from my family. My dad was, in the military. Of course, he joined the Foreign Service later. I was raised Catholic. My mom was always, really proud about like community service, being involved in government, staying engaged, just being a good citizen. That's actually like one of the things that she said before she passed. And we did kind of an interview for, her grandchildren. And she was all about just like be the best American you can be a good citizen. And that includes things like, scouting. So she was like our Girl Scout troop leader. I became our Girl Scout troop leader for my daughters. Anyhow, it just to reflect back on like you give back to your family, you give back to the community,
Yeah.
and it just made sense that you help people when they're in need. So
Yeah.
as I spent more time doing it, I fell in love with it more and more, and it just connected so much that Danny and I, my husband and I, have raised our family overseas. So we have 3 children. We've taken them to different places that are, some of our family are like, wait, you're going where? Where are you taking our
Yeah.
grandchildren?
Yeah. And maybe you can speak a bit to that. And by the way, there were two things you said that maybe that resonated in particular. One was starting out in this line of work, and despite having appeared to have grown up around it, it doesn't mean you really know what it is until you start doing it.
Correct.
That's exactly the same experience I had, and started at the same place you did a couple years after you.
Yeah.
And it had exactly the same sentiment and reaction that I wasn't, when I landed the job, I remember really being very humbled and just being like, I can't believe I got this job.
Yes.
And people saying why, I'm like, I didn't have it in my mind that I would just, kind of do whatever I wanted. It was a hard line of work to get into. Or it felt like it was going to be a hard line of work to get into. But anyhow, the other thing is getting more into the work is how practical that project was. And not that we need to go
Yeah.
into any more detail about that, because that's one of those, the FUSE project, the Famine Early Warning Systems Global Program, that has a very sophisticated system for anticipating famine. And famines in developing countries literally will kill millions of people. You're not
Exactly.
talking about a small scale problem. It's an absolute crisis. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't get ahead of one, that's what happens, right? So the practicality and just sort of the sensibility, that the more
Yeah.
I got into the work line of learning that. So maybe you were going to speak a bit to your actual overseas postings and where you were. And if I remember right, you were in the Philippines and Ethiopia.
Yeah. Yeah. So Danny and I moved with our two daughters in 2015. We moved to the Philippines. And I worked on a project there called ePeso, which was a project all about expanding financial inclusion for Filipinos. And most people, including myself at the time, were like, what does that mean, including financial or like expanding financial inclusion?
Right.
Well, it's really simple when you think about it in terms of cash and having a cash-based economy. So in 2015, about 99% of all payments, all transactions done in the country were done in cash. So if you were buying a house, if you were buying a car,
Right.
you had to go get cash. And going to the banks is such an arduous process. I remember, it was very common to walk past a bank and you would see dozens and dozens of people waiting hours and hours. And these are poor people oftentimes, like taking a day off of work to go just get your weekly pay, cash, if you got a check, for example. Um, and more than that, it's like this is also like a growing economy.
Right.
A lot of companies, American companies and other companies want to do business in the Philippines, and you need to have an easy way to transact. And same thing with like taxes and revenue collection. You need to have an easy way to recover taxes. Um, and really like kind of like the spookier side of it is I don't think a lot of Americans know that the plot for 9/11 was created in the Philippines and kind of tested out in the Philippines. And so when you think about like all those layers, just like that everyday, Filipino that has a hard time accessing their money and transmitting money, to like the geopolitical risks that are entailed with not being able to track the flow of money. It was a really important project. I think it was scoped at like $25 million, but ended up being about $12 million. It was more successful than I think USAID even envisioned because the goal of it was to go from like 1 to 2% of electronic payments being done to 20% in a 5-year period. So the project actually accomplished that with half the money. And we did it by working really closely with the Central Bank of the Philippines. They were drivers of the project. They wanted, an
Yeah.
interoperable electronic payment system. They just needed a little support in terms of like project management. And we brought in some experts who had done, created interoperable systems in other countries to come in and just provide, some advisory support. And so it was really the central bank that, was driving this initiative. And so that's why it was so successful. It was co-created, I think, but really driven by Philippines. And then they knew exactly what they needed and we delivered it. We supported them on it. And so I'm really
Yeah.
proud. I don't know exactly the volume of electronic payments now that it's 2025, 10 years after that project, but it had surpassed its initial goals 5 years in. And
And on something like that, it's there's obviously been, well, given what we've dealt with the last few months, you know, um, some very politicized criticisms of the American foreign aid apparatus and system and everything, that we don't need to go into here. But sometimes the aid work is hard to explain,
yeah,
including when it can be very impactful and valuable and important for a lot of reasons. But
yeah.
what's interesting about this example is, I don't think that I don't think that applies here, right? And another piece that's interesting to me is the point you emphasized that the Filipino central bank was driving it and really
Mhm.
wanted this. And when that's happening, and you actually have this local counterpart or leading institution, it's very different, isn't it?
Mhm.
And I'm not going to say that our aid system was perfect by any means, and nor do I
Well,
think you would, right? But that was a fundamental element that I think, in particular, anyone doing the work on the ground I've ever known or talked to, and I've been out, lived overseas doing the work myself, where when you had that, it was a different story. I mean, there was a lot
yeah.
more to be accomplished.
The stars align,
Right.
where it's like your shared values come together and you have champions on both sides and you've got the expertise, the local government, the experts that are coming in from overseas. You just complement each other and you're working, you're rowing together towards a common goal. It was really special. And you're right. Like development is not perfect. And sometimes the process is part of it, but I'll tell you I never saw so much pro-American sentiment in my life
Yeah.
outside of the United States than in the Philippines. Like you can't walk down the street without somebody wearing an American flag, a T-shirt, or just telling. They always have a story about like my family member in the United States. They were so pro-America, and there's a long shared history between the Philippines and the United States, as you know, um, military history and like linked our countries. But still today, like just to give back on some of these important matters that really help them stabilize. Uh, it's honestly, it goes back to, we were talking about kind of the value system and why I got into development, but it really goes back to like, my faith. I was raised with the values of, especially, to whom much is given, much is required. And I just believe that so much that we as Americans, we are so fortunate. We all know that. But I mean, when you see abject poverty up close, when you see children in the streets raising other children in dirty clothes, um, not having a house to go to, not having a safe place to go to, you never get that out of your mind. You can never not see it once you've seen it. And we, as Americans, like this is part of why I still believe so much in it, even though there are really challenging, I mean, there are many Americans who are struggling. It's just on another level overseas. Um,
It
and it's,
is. Yes, you can't unsee certain things. Um, it's also the interesting thing about your Philippines experience, story, examples, details, all of that is, not only is there sort of not only is it an easy, I think it's easy. People, maybe others don't, probably, but Not only is there a case to be made for doing the right thing, but when you think about how much harder it would be to design a terrorist plot against the United States out of a country where you can track a significantly higher portion of the transactions, the selfish side of things makes a bit more sense too, or comes out right.
How do you mean? When?
When you were saying that the 9/11,
Oh yeah.
uh, plot
Oh,
originated out of there, and like, would that be harder now? And we don't have the data to analyze that and talk about it right now, I think, but I think that's another piece that's very interesting in your kind of
it's
what you
really
said.
interesting. I mean, because I've thought about it so much, especially having to explain, what type of project I was working on to, my family. And a lot of them don't work in international settings. And so it's like, why is this important? Why should America be giving money to help Filipinos get access to banking services? And really, it's like there's like kind of this basic level that I understand. People should be able to operate their lives efficiently. Like I should be able to make money transfers easily. And that's something that's like an easy to solve problem on the surface. But then it's like all these reasons of like why it's important on a national level and then an international level. And especially when it comes to like illicit trade and affairs, you got to know where money's going. And so could we, have prevented it? The not prevented it, but rather like it's just another deterrent for illegal actors um, to not do something in some countries because it's easily traceable.
Yeah. And the other, again, just sort of practical piece to this kind of the example of increasing access to proper banking services is just I really also have seen, there's a lot of evidence to prove this, that the more that you enable someone to be prosperous, the less likely they are to be inclined to to participate in something nefarious like that. Right.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and something like a more sophisticated and developed banking system doesn't disappear overnight because the people that helped put it in place move on, right?
No, exactly. I mean, I was thinking about this too. Like, one of my early jobs was I was a nanny for this kind of like fancy babysitting agency in Washington, D.C. Anyhow, these dot-com millionaires, I remember them. I was babysitting the kids while they went overseas and they were doing a trip to certain countries in Asia and they were looking at investment opportunities. And I remember them coming back and they were like, no, it's not going to work. And it was because of corruption. They didn't have confidence in the financial system to invest their money. And, corruption comes in at like there are lots of opportunities for it. So I won't say it's just one thing, but when American companies or any companies around the world are thinking about where to do business, they're looking at all these factors. They're looking at government. They're looking at, the market, like opportunities, but just the safety and security of funds, the workforce. And so it just all comes together. We're a global ecosystem. And we, anyhow, I can go on about it,
Yeah,
but
sure. Yeah, and I mean, um, even speaking to the workforce, I mean, one of the programs I got to work on pretty uh, um, from afar, but I got to go out to Egypt and work on a workforce development, technical vocation, technical and vocational education training program that grew to be quite large because it was so successful, because they partnered so closely with private industry, by the way, and businesses.
mhm.
But the whole premise of that was giving more access to young people who otherwise would not have had access to high quality education. But this was specific and just very practical because it was technical training. It was not necessarily higher educations. Some of the kids who went through these programs actually did go on to higher education, but anyway, that's one of those areas that I actually think it has always gotten a lot less attention. That
Workforce development.
workforce development, and there's been a lot of good work USAID had done there as well. But Anyway, maybe you can speak a bit to what you did in Ethiopia too.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, Danny and I decided we wanted to have another overseas trip. Or not a trip, but we wanted to live overseas again. We wanted to introduce our children to countries in Africa. So I was there in January 2020, getting our house all set up and getting the kids enrolled in school. And this thing was happening,
Yeah.
the virus. And I was like, oh, it must be a slow news day on CNN. They keep talking about this day after day. We were supposed to move there April 1st, 2020. And anyhow, the project that I was out there to start on it was a PEPFAR funded project. And PEPFAR, let's see if I remember this right, Presidential Emergency.
The
Yeah,
President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
yeah.
There you go.
So the project is part of this global program, and Ethiopia was one of like 50 countries
Right.
that brought in medicines and medical equipment to the individual country. So we were bringing in medicines and medical equipment for HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention, malaria, tuberculosis, and emerging diseases such as COVID. So, anyhow, long story short, I had to really fight with my employer at the time to send us out there because the biggest fear was that the company was going to send us as hosts, when we would be bringing the virus from the United States and then infecting a local population. So I did everything I could, lots and lots of testing and, 2 weeks of quarantine in our house to get out there. Finally, in August 2020, we got out there. And it was such a meaningful project because it just makes so much sense. You bring it's all about like disease transmission, trying to reduce the spread of diseases because we know, especially from the pandemic, that diseases don't honor geographical borders.
No.
They go everywhere. And it truly, I mean, it started, as you know, like because AIDS was an epidemic across the continent of Africa. I've heard stories that, in Uganda, for example, they were running out of coffins because so many people were dying and they couldn't keep up with the death. That was kind of like it started with like the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus paying attention to like what was happening. They conveyed interest to President Clinton at the time. Eventually, I think President Bush was the one who helped PEPFAR get realized, and it saved, tens of millions of people across the continent. And just think about like the potential disease spread around the world had we not, contained and mitigated the transmission. So it just made a lot of sense to me. And plus,
Yeah.
it's the right thing to do. You think about like women being infected, then the babies are infected, children. It's heartbreaking. So it felt
Yeah.
really good. It was a national project. Unfortunately, a civil war started while we were there, and so we had to figure out how to implement this project with like the heart or the center of that conflict being in one of the regional health or hubs where we worked. And I'm proud to say that we did it. We kept our staff safe. We were able to keep implementing the project and getting medicines and equipment, disseminated, despite all these challenges of like COVID and then the war, you name it.
Yeah. No, that's great. And the PEPFAR, the PEPFAR programs, that's been in the headlines a lot because there are a lot of people advocating to at least preserve as much of that as possible. And a lot of it, I'm going to be controversial and say allegedly was preserved. And I say that just because I don't think people understand that you don't just fly a bunch of pharmaceuticals to Ethiopia and drop them off.
No.
The global supply, the complexity and sophistication of the global supply chain required to do that, the health workers that have to be trained. And by the way, and you know this, but there's quite a bit more that go into those programs too, because the more developed a country is, the quicker you can kind of wean people off of the aids so that they can actually do it themselves. And I think there's been a lot of explicit and implicit stuff out there suggesting that that's not how the programs were designed, which just simply isn't true. For the most part, these programs were, that was the point, is that you're, where possible, and it has often been possible, you're training people in the local market to do this, and you're building up the systems and the kind of infrastructure so that countries can take it over. I mean, South Africa, I don't think South Africa ever, they always paid for the pharmaceuticals. They've always paid for the pharmaceuticals themselves. And that was one of the worst affected areas originally, or worst affected
Yeah.
countries, right?
I'll say I was the only expatriate on that project. So a national program, I think the amount of money that was, budgeted per year was about $50 million. I was the only expatriate. Everyone else was Ethiopian. So I was really proud to serve alongside Ethiopian nationals. They were doing all the work. They were the experts. You're 100%. And they were also doing things like health system strengthening. And that's just another, it's like training, capacity building, so that, they can manage these programs. I'm just a firm believer, and everybody needs a helping hand at some point in their life. Some people have an easier start in life, an easier opportunity. Some people have a lot of roadblocks in front of them, but we all have potential. And I mean, Ethiopians are amazing, smart, interesting. It's just such a vibrant and important culture. There are
And
so many Ethiopians here in the DC area. It's like the second largest diaspora out of Ethiopia, and it's like they bring so much to our community. Anyhow,
yeah,
of course they can do this. They just need a little help, when it comes to like the funding at this point.
yeah. Well said. Well said. One thing I did want to also just kind of hear from you about a bit more, and a lot of this will be a kind of, you know, things maybe we've spent less time talking about because it's more recent. But when you left, when you came back from Ethiopia, not that long after, right? You moved on you took over the Heartland Alliance. Is that right?
Yeah, Heartland Alliance International.
International.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a really, so I kind of I moved out of for-profit, USAID project management into nonprofit work. And that was really because um, what I was seeing happen in the United States, whether, it's about like gun violence or, like also children here struggling to get access to food, healthcare, that sort of thing. I wanted to give back both domestically in my country, the United States, as well as internationally. And so Heartland Alliance International was a really great place to work because they did both. They needed help, with managing their international programs. But it all started, it was an anti poverty, nonprofit that started in the late 1800s in Chicago by America's first social worker, Jane Addams. And she was a believer. She loved Charles Dickens. She loved, when she was traveling in England, she learned about settlement houses, to help people who were new arrivals in different cities to have a safe place to stay while they pursued, economic opportunities or education, whatever it was. Especially women needed to have a safe place to stay if they weren't traveling with a family and like a husband or a father. So she was this kind of society lady that would meet people at the train station in Chicago and help them get set up. So she set up whole houses in Chicago, and they became this vibrant place where new Americans or new arrivals, traveling across the country and making a home in the Midwest, had a safe place to stay. And, she did things like she advocated for, children's like playgrounds and education and clean water. And it grew and grew and grew. So eventually, when I show up in like 2022, they had started doing work internationally. And it's all based on, human rights and dignity for the person. We don't take a look at like, I don't know how to say this, but it's just a belief that like you're
Yeah.
owed basic rights. like your child has access to medicine, they have access to education, you are free from discrimination, just so you can live your life. And so we manage projects. My job was to get the international portfolio kind of under control because they were going after work that was within their mission, but they couldn't afford to implement. So they weren't recovering the costs they needed just to break even. And that's the whole goal of a nonprofit, is just to break
Yeah.
even doing these community public service projects that benefit society. So yeah, it was so great, and it exposed me to, like, I worked for USAID projects. We managed State Department, like, human rights projects. A number of these bureaus, I think, are going away, which was really sad to me.
Yeah.
Um, but UNHCR, that's a Human Rights Commission for the UN, and then lots of private foundations and private donors would contribute to programs. And I just got to see a totally different side of, development and humanitarian work that I had seen before with USAID. And it was really like homegrown, much more grassroots, where you can really connect with the work. And we worked all over. We worked in Colombia, Dominican Republic, different countries in Africa like Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria. We were starting to work in Ukraine. We worked in Iraq for decades, lots of different places. And it was always so meaningful because really it was like most of our work was paid for by the federal government. So that was State Department or USAID. And it was all about just like bringing some like basic project management around like legal services for Syrian refugees, for example, or, providing support to people who were oppressed for religious reasons in Iraq, for example. Um, I mean, so many really important things to help people just stabilize so that they can then get legal documentation and then get their kids enrolled in school and safely rent an apartment and then contribute, economically to wherever they're based. So we help stabilize a lot of families.
And that's interesting when you think about the history of the United States too, because the earliest American families, many of these groups came over here to escape religious persecution. Christians came here to escape religious persecution.
My family
And
came here for that reason in the 1500s. Yeah,
there you go. Um, and you know, it's interesting to think about that and um, how important I think it remains to continue to welcome people into the country and allow them to practice their religion freely in the United States. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And I don't think I realized that actually about the Heartland Alliance and what their work is or maybe was.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do a lot of different work, and it's actually separated into four separate companies at this point. But they were doing healthcare for homeless populations in Chicago. They were doing work to help people who were, especially you see it in the headlines now, like so many Venezuelan refugees that had ended up in Chicago without, even so much as a coat during the winter. They'd never experienced winter the way that
Yeah.
Chicago can bring winter. And so they'll bring you a coat, but they'll also help you get language services. They will help you get, access to legal services so that you can stand up your family safely, legally, and then begin contributing in a way that's like doesn't keep those people in the shadows of our economy to be exploited or, you can imagine.
Or
So
have people end up in a position of desperation. And, that's when
absolutely.
people are,
That was one of
are,
the really interesting projects we worked on in the Dominican Republic. And it relates a lot back to what's happening in the United States now, where we talk about birthright citizenship. I didn't know this. You may know this. But in the Dominican Republic, they repealed birthright citizenship, which had been a right for 100 years,
hmm,
right? But they didn't just stop it then. What they did is they made it retroactive back to like 1930s or something. And it was racially motivated, I believe, to
yeah.
go after Haitian Dominicans or Dominicans of Haitian origin. And so then it's like suddenly not just like the child that I've given birth to, But me, my mother, my grandmother, great grandmother, going back to the 30s, would have all not had, we would have just become a stateless population overnight, which is what happened there. And so then these, Dominicans of Haitian origin, sometimes they would be rounded up and sent back to Haiti, a country they didn't speak the language and didn't know, anything about really. But a lot of them were then pushed into jobs illegally in like the sugarcane industry and exploited, low wages. Children don't have access to care. You know what I mean? Like they end up
That's
just
crazy. I actually did not know
mistreated.
this. Yeah.
I know. I didn't know it either but the United States government was funding a project to support, the Dominican government to rectify, a lot of these injustices that they had applied to people. So it was actually like the TIP office, trafficking in persons. I think that's what it was, that funded this project because United States was trying to help the Dominican Republic because they wanted to like fix the issue that had been caused by this policy, but they couldn't keep up with the volume of cases that they were now confronted with trying to fix. And I worry about that, to be honest, with what's happening in the United States right now when we talk about birthright citizenship and they're talking about denaturalizing people. And it's like, whoa, this will go back generations because we are all immigrants. We are
Yeah.
all, I mean, unless you're a Native American, you came here from a different country at some point.
Yeah. It is. It is scary. It is scary.
It is
Um,
scary. And anyhow, it goes back to like American values of like, why do we do this work? Because it's the right thing to do, to protect children, to help countries. It used to be supported, it was enjoyed as bipartisan support foreign aid
yeah.
because, you can teach a man to fish and he can feed himself and his family, or you can give a fish. And it's like, no, let's teach the man to fish. And then they stand up on their own. They become great trading partners. They become a stabilized country. We enjoy lots of like different types of relationships like tourism and economic transfers or, you name it. But I think this idea of just isolating the United States and suddenly giving up on what we've done for decades, it really, it's just so counter to who we are and what made us great. I'm
I
getting a
agree.
little political here, so
I mean, I think we'll all lose. That's the thing. It's not, these things aren't zero sum games.
correct.
Um, and that's what worries me too. Melissa, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining the podcast today. And thanks everyone for listening in.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks a lot again for joining us today. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and share far and wide. See you next time.